It began on a cold, wind-lashed night. The waves hammered the jagged rocks below, and the wind howled through the cracks of the old lighthouse. I was on duty with my two fellow keepers, Ethan and Jackson. The three of us had worked this stretch of coast for months, maintaining the light that kept ships away from the treacherous shores. It was a job that called for silence and vigilance, and in the isolation we had grown accustomed to each other's presence, even if we rarely spoke. That night things started to go wrong. I was sitting at the desk staring blankly at the logbook, noting the flicker of the light as it swept across the churning sea. Ethan had gone outside to check the oil reserves, something routine, but he'd been gone longer than expected. A gust of wind slammed against the door, rattling it in its frame, but no footsteps followed. I waited. The minutes dragged by. Eventually, I left the warmth of the room and stepped into the cold night. I searched the perimeter, calling his name into the darkness. The wind carried my voice away, leaving me alone with the crash of the waves. There was no sign of Ethan, no trace that he had been there at all. He was gone, swallowed by the night. I ran back inside and tried the radio, calling for help, but it was nothing but static, a constant grating hiss that seemed louder than it should have been, as if the sound itself was closing in around me. I tried again, but no reply came. Jackson appeared behind me, his face pale, and I could tell he'd already guessed what had happened. The next few hours passed in a blur of tension. We stayed in the main room, not daring to leave each other's sight. The lighthouse was old, creaking under the weight of the storm, but there was something else, too. A sound that didn't belong. A clicking. It echoed from somewhere deep within the lighthouse, a rhythmic pattern that seemed to resonate with the pulse of the sea. We searched every corner of the place, but the source remained elusive, always just beyond our reach. That first night passed, and we told ourselves that if we just stayed alert, we'd be fine. We'd make it until the relief boat came in a few days. Jackson and I agreed that one of us should always be awake, no matter how tired we were. But the clicking sound grew louder, and sleep was hard to fend off. By the third night, we were both on edge, barely speaking. We hadn't heard from Ethan, hadn't heard anything but the wind and that infernal clicking. It was inside the walls. I was sure of it, moving, always moving, but there was nothing to find, no place for it to hide. On that night, despite our best efforts, exhaustion overcame us. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke to find myself alone in the room. The fire had burned low, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. Jackson's chair was empty. I called his name, but there was no answer. The clicking had stopped, replaced by an unnerving silence. I searched every room, every stairwell, my heart pounding. But like Ethan, Jackson was simply gone. I returned to the radio, the static louder than ever, more like a presence than just interference. I tried sending out a distress call again, my voice shaking, but the static swallowed it whole. There was no one out there, no one listening. For hours, I sat in the darkened lighthouse, alone, waiting. But something was wrong with the silence. My mind played tricks on me, making the shadows seem to shift and twist when I wasn't looking. I kept hearing that sound again, the clicking, faint but persistent. Every time I stood still, it was there, creeping into the edges of my awareness. But when I moved to investigate, it would stop, as though it knew I was coming. I don't know how much time passed. The nights blended together. The waves outside seemed louder than they should be. The wind sharper, almost like a whisper at the back of my neck. I tried not to sleep, but my body was failing me, and my thoughts were becoming tangled. The sound was in my head now. The clicking. It was everywhere. In the walls, in the floor, under my skin. I couldn't take it anymore. I must have drifted off because when I opened my eyes again, it was dark. The fire had died completely, and I couldn't see a thing. But I heard it. The clicking, right behind me. I shot out of my chair, scrambling to light the lamp, but my hands were shaking, clumsy. The noise grew louder, impossibly close, and then everything went still. The air in the room seemed to press against me from all sides. I don't know how to describe what happened next. There was no wind, no creaking of the old beams, just a sensation, as though the very space around me was tightening. I turned slowly, and that's when I saw it. A faint movement in the darkness, something shifting just beyond the reach of the light. The clicking was there, surrounding me, growing louder with every passing second until it filled my head completely. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out, and then I was gone. When the boat arrived for our shift change, they found the lighthouse empty. The light was still turning, cutting through the night. But there were no signs of us. No trace of where we had gone. No signs of a struggle. Nothing. Only the wind, the waves, and the soft, distant sound of clicking. I don't know why I decided to stop. It was late in the afternoon when I saw the lighthouse standing alone at the edge of the cliffs, a jagged silhouette against the gray sky. I'd been driving up the coast, no real destination in mind, just putting miles between me and everything else. The road had wound through forests and fields, skirting along the shore until I spotted the tower in the distance. There was something about it, standing there all by itself, that made me want to get closer. I pulled the car off to the side of the narrow road, gravel crunching under the tires, and stepped out. The wind was colder than I'd expected, carrying the faint smell of salt water and decay. A dirt path led from the road toward the cliffs, overgrown and barely visible. The lighthouse looked abandoned, its windows dark and cracked, the metal railing on the gallery rusted and broken. I thought about how long it had been since anyone had needed this place, back when ships relied on lights like these to keep them from crashing into the rocks. It didn't take long to reach the base of the lighthouse. Up close it looked even more neglected, weathered stone, streaked with moss and grime, the door half hanging off its hinges. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity pulled me forward. I'd always been drawn to old, forgotten places like this. There was a strange allure to them, like stepping into a piece of history, a place where time had stopped. Inside, the smell hit me first, damp and stale, the scent of rotting wood and rusting metal. The floor was covered in debris, broken glass, crumpled paper, scraps of wood. The walls were covered in flaking paint, pale yellow turning to gray with age. I could hear the faint sound of the wind outside, whistling through cracks in the stone. The only light came from the setting sun, filtering through the broken windows. I made my way toward the spiral staircase that led up to the tower. It was narrow, iron, and every step groaned under my weight. As I climbed, the sense of isolation deepened. It wasn't just that the place was empty, it felt like it had been forgotten by the world. A place that existed outside of time, where no one would think to look. I reached the top and stepped out onto the gallery. The wind was stronger up here, pulling at my jacket as I looked out over the cliffs. The sea stretched out in all directions, gray and endless, waves crashing far below. The land was just as desolate, the path I had walked already blending into the wild grass and brambles. I was completely alone. And then I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the path, near where I'd parked my car. At first I thought it might be a trick of the light, the fading sun casting strange shadows. But as I stared, I realized it wasn't a shadow. Someone was standing there, facing the lighthouse, motionless. I blinked, my heart picking up pace. The figure didn't move, just stood there, staring, or at least I assumed they were staring, though I couldn't make out any details from this distance. It was unsettling, the way they were so still, so quiet, like they were waiting for something. I backed away from the railing, my pulse quickening. Maybe it was just someone passing by, curious like I had been. But as I turned to head back down the stairs, a sudden sense of dread washed over me. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. This part of the coast was remote, far from any towns or houses, and whoever it was, they hadn't been there when I arrived. I descended the stairs, each step echoing loudly in the silence of the lighthouse. The further down I went, the darker it got, until I was in near total shadow. I paused at the bottom, listening. The wind had picked up outside, howling through the open door, but there was something else. A faint sound like footsteps, slow and methodical, coming from just outside. I froze, heart pounding. I hadn't seen anyone approach the lighthouse. I should have heard them if they had. But now the footsteps were unmistakable, growing louder, drawing closer. Someone was walking toward the entrance. I ducked behind a crumbling wall, crouching low, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I could hear the faint creak of the door as it swung open, followed by a long silence. I strained to listen, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no breathing. Just the wind rattling through the broken windows. I waited, my muscles tense, ready to bolt at the first sign of movement. But the silence stretched on. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was just a traveler, someone curious about the lighthouse like I had been. Maybe I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. There was no reason for anyone to be out here, in a place like this, at this time of day. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I peered around the edge of the wall, my eyes scanning the darkened room. The door was half open, swinging gently in the wind. but the figure I had seen outside was gone. I stood slowly, my legs shaking, and crept toward the entrance. The path was empty, the car still sitting where I'd left it, but the figure was nowhere to be seen. It was as if they had vanished into the fading light. I hurried back to my car, glancing over my shoulder every few steps, expecting to see someone following me, but there was no one. By the time I reached the car, the sun had almost completely set, the sky turning a deep shade of gray. I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling, and started the engine. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, convinced that I would see the figure again, standing in the road behind me. But the road remained empty, the lighthouse growing smaller in the distance. I thought that would be the end of it, just a strange encounter in an abandoned place. But as I drove through the darkness, that feeling of being watched didn't go away. I kept glancing at the shadows on the side of the road, half expecting something to emerge from the trees, something that had followed me from the lighthouse. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure standing at the edge of the path, staring at the lighthouse. I woke up several times, my heart racing, convinced that someone was outside my window watching. The next day, I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the feeling of being followed stayed with me. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me. At the gas station, on the highway, even in the crowded diner where I stopped for lunch. I kept seeing things out of the corner of my eye, dark shapes, figures standing just at the edge of my vision, disappearing when I turned to look. By the third day, I was starting to unravel. I hadn't slept more than a few hours, and every noise, every shadow made my pulse race. I couldn't concentrate. All I could think about was the lighthouse and that figure and the sense that I had left something behind, something that wasn't finished with me. That night I woke to the sound of footsteps. They were faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Someone walking outside my window. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest, and listened. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped. I held my breath, waiting for them to start again, but there was only silence. I got out of bed, moving to the window, and peered out into the darkness. The yard outside was empty, no sign of anyone. But as I turned to go back to bed, I saw it, standing at the edge of the tree line, half hidden in the shadows. The figure, the same one I had seen at the lighthouse. It stood perfectly still, just like before, watching. Working as a lighthouse keeper isn't exactly a glamorous job, but it suited me. I liked the isolation, the routine of it. There was something comforting about knowing what each day would bring. The sweeping beam of light cutting through the night, the rhythm of the waves crashing against the rocks below. It was just me, the ocean, and my two fellow keepers, Davies and Griffiths, living out there on a spit of rock, miles from the nearest town. The lighthouse was built on a small island, barely more than a jagged outcrop of stone rising from the sea. The cliffs were steep, the waters treacherous, but the view was something else. On clear days, the horizon stretched out forever, an endless line where the sky met the water. But at night, when the light was sweeping through the darkness, that's when it really felt like another world. We worked in shifts, always 2 men awake, 1 asleep, rotating through the long nights. The light needed constant attention, and there were logs to keep, weather reports to monitor. It was a quiet life, but we didn't mind it. We were all used to the solitude, to the way time seemed to stretch out here, slow and unhurried. But then there were the nights when the sea changed. It didn't happen all at once. At first it was just small things, strange noises carried on the wind, barely audible over the sound of the waves. I heard them one night while I was on watch. A soft clicking, like rocks tapping together far out on the water. It wasn't the usual sounds we were accustomed to, the gulls, the creak of the tower, the groan of the wind through the cracks. This was something different. It was faint but persistent, drifting in and out with the tide. I chalked it up to the natural sounds of the sea, maybe some loose debris or fish beneath the waves. The next night, Davies mentioned he'd heard it too. He shrugged it off, said it was probably nothing, but there was a tightness in his voice that didn't sit right, and the sound didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder. By the third night, it was more frequent, a sharp, intermittent noise that echoed off the cliffs, impossible to ignore. And then came the smell. It drifted up from the shore, carried on the breeze, a stench of salt and decay that clung to everything. It reminded me of dead fish, but heavier, like something rotting beneath the surface. It would come and go, sometimes faint, sometimes strong enough to make your stomach churn. We searched the rocks below, thinking maybe a large sea creature had washed up on the shore, but found nothing. The island was bare, the rocks slick with seawater, but there were no signs of life or death. Griffiths was the first to really voice what we were all thinking, that there was something out there, something in the water, watching us. We'd all seen the shadows moving in the waves at night, just outside the range of the lighthouse beam. At first, I thought they were schools of fish, maybe seals, but they didn't move like anything I'd ever seen. They were too big, and they moved too fast, darting in and out of the light in ways that made my skin crawl. I started to notice other things too. The birds had stopped coming. The gulls, usually a constant presence around the tower, were gone. The only sound now was the relentless crashing of the waves and that damned clicking noise growing louder each night. We should have left then. I think deep down we all knew that. But leaving the lighthouse meant waiting for the supply boat, and we weren't due for another week. Besides, none of us wanted to admit that we were scared. The isolation of the job had a way of messing with your head, making you see things that weren't there, hear things that weren't real. We figured it was just the sea playing tricks on us. Then came the night the storm rolled in. The wind had been picking up all afternoon, the waves growing larger, more violent. By nightfall, the sea was a mass of whitecaps, crashing against the rocks with enough force to shake the tower. The storm hit fast, dark clouds swallowing the sky, rain lashing the windows. The light from the tower cut through the downpour, but it was like shining a flashlight into the abyss, just endless darkness with the occasional glimpse of the angry ocean below. Davies and I were on watch that night. Griffiths was asleep, or trying to sleep, in his bunk below. The storm had us on edge, the sound of the wind and rain deafening. We kept checking the light, making sure it was working properly. But even the strongest beam seemed futile against the storm. It was hard to focus with the constant rattling, the way the wind howled around the tower. But something else was gnawing at me. That clicking noise, louder than ever now, coming from the ocean. I leaned out the window, peering into the darkness. The rain blurred everything, but I could just make out the black shape of the rocks below, the waves breaking over them. And then I saw it, a shadow in the water. Something large, moving just beneath the surface, too big to be a fish. My heart skipped a beat, and I pulled back, eyes fixed on the spot where it had disappeared. Davies must have seen it too, because he was suddenly at my side, staring out into the storm with a look I hadn't seen before. Fear. The shadow reappeared, closer this time. It was enormous, gliding through the water with a strange grace, far too fast for the size of it. I could make out long, twisting shapes beneath the surface, writhing, almost like tentacles. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't alone. More shadows were rising from the depths, breaking the surface in the distance, black shapes cutting through the waves. They were circling the island, moving with terrifying speed, like predators closing in on their prey. And then the tower shook. At first I thought it was the wind, but the vibration was different, deeper, like something had hit the base of the lighthouse. Davies and I exchanged a look, the same thought crossing both our minds. Griffiths. We rushed down the stairs, calling out to him, but before we reached the bottom, the entire structure groaned under the force of another impact. Something was hitting the tower, hard. We reached the lower level and found Griffiths awake, wide-eyed, already scrambling for the door. The sound outside was unbearable now, a deep, resonant thudding that echoed through the stone walls, followed by the clicking, louder and more insistent than ever. It was as if something was testing the structure, searching for a way in. And then the first crack appeared. The wall facing the sea, where the tower met the ground, split open with a deafening crack, seawater pouring in through the gap. The force of the next impact sent us all sprawling, the tower swaying dangerously as the ground beneath us shuddered. I struggled to my feet, my heart racing, and for the first time, I saw it, really saw it. A massive shape, rising from the sea, silhouetted against the storm. It towered over the rocks, over the lighthouse, its body a writhing mass of limbs and scales. The tentacles, there must have been dozens of them, lashed out, wrapping around the base of the tower, pulling with a force that shook the ground beneath my feet. We ran. There was nothing else we could do. We made it out just as another impact rocked the lighthouse. The ground beneath us buckled, the stones shifting under our feet as the tower groaned in protest. I looked back just in time to see the top of the lighthouse tilt, the beam of light cutting through the storm at an odd angle before the entire structure began to collapse. The sea creatures, whatever they were, surged forward, their bodies breaking the surface of the water, their tentacles lashing out, pulling the tower down into the waves. The sound of the collapse was deafening, the stone crumbling like sand, swallowed by the sea. We stumbled away, barely able to stand as the ground trembled beneath us. The storm raged on, the rain blinding, the wind howling in our ears, but all I could focus on was the water. The creatures were still there, moving beneath the surface, circling the island, waiting. We had nowhere to go. The storm would pass, but the sea wasn't done with us. Not yet. I don't know how long we've been waiting now, huddled together on the highest point of the island, watching the water. But the shadows are still there, just below the surface, and the clicking hasn't stopped. I don't think it ever will. Lighthouses have always fascinated me. Something about their isolation, their purpose, standing out there on the edge of the world, guiding ships away from the rocks. I thought working in one would offer a sense of peace, a place to think, to be alone with my thoughts and the sea. It turns out I was wrong. I signed up for a 6-month stint at the Lighthouse off the northern coast. The place was remote, miles from any town, perched on a cliff above a jagged shoreline. The only way to reach it was by boat, and once you were there, you were cut off from the rest of the world. The waves beat relentlessly against the rocks below, the wind a constant presence, whistling through the narrow windows of the tower. It was just me and 2 other men, McAllister, who had been working lighthouses his whole life, and O'Leary, like me, relatively new to the isolation. From the moment I arrived, the place felt different than I had expected. Not in any obvious way, nothing you could put your finger on, but there was a strangeness to it. The tower was older than it looked from a distance. The stone walls were weathered, pitted with age, and there was a dampness that seemed to cling to everything, a kind of cold that never went away. But I brushed it off as just part of the job. After all, this was what I'd signed up for. Long days and even longer nights with only the light and the sea for company. At first, everything was routine. We kept the light going, made repairs when necessary, logged the weather, and watched the endless expanse of water. There was comfort in the monotony, in knowing exactly what each day would bring. But it didn't take long for that comfort to give way to something else, something darker. The first thing I noticed was the noise. Lighthouses are full of noises, the creaking of the old beams, the wind rattling the windows, the distant crash of waves. But this was different. It started out faint, just a soft scratching sound, almost like nails on wood. At first I thought it was a rat or some small creature scurrying in the walls. But it wasn't just in one place. It followed me, moving from room to room, always just at the edge of hearing. I didn't say anything to McAllister or O'Leary at first. It felt silly, something a greenhorn like me would get worked up about. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more persistent it became. Every time I was alone, there it was, faint, scratching, sometimes tapping. At night, when it was my turn to keep watch, I'd sit in the tower, the light sweeping over the sea, and hear it behind me, always just behind me, in the stairwell or the walls. One night I couldn't take it anymore. I went downstairs, intending to search the lower levels to find the source of the noise. I carried a lantern with me, the only light apart from the beam from the tower above. The stairs creaked under my feet as I descended. The sound was louder here, almost as if it was coming from beneath the floor itself. When I reached the bottom, I found the small cellar door. McAllister had mentioned it when I first arrived, saying it hadn't been used in years. He told me there was nothing down there except damp and rot. But the scratching was louder now, coming from somewhere below. I pushed the door open, half expecting to find a nest of rats. Instead, I was met with the smell of damp earth, musty and stale. The stairs leading down into the darkness were slick, covered in moss or something worse. I hesitated, holding the lantern in front of me. The light barely penetrated the gloom, but I could see the rough stone walls, the worn steps. I called out, but the only sound was my own breathing and that soft, maddening scratching. I started down, each step slow and measured, the cold growing stronger the deeper I went. At the bottom, I found the cellar. It was smaller than I expected, just a narrow, low-ceilinged room with stone walls. In one corner, there was a pile of debris, old wood, a few broken crates, nothing significant. But the scratching was still there. louder now, more insistent. I swung the lantern around, trying to pinpoint the source, but there was nothing. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw something. A shape, barely visible in the flickering light, standing at the far end of the cellar. For a moment, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, but it was there, motionless, a figure hunched and draped in something dark. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. I froze, my heart racing, the lantern shaking in my hand. I backed away slowly, not daring to take my eyes off it. But as I reached the stairs, the light flickered, just for an instant, and when it steadied again, the figure was gone. The cellar was empty. I didn't mention the incident to McAllister or O'Leary. How could I? I wasn't even sure I'd seen anything at all. Maybe it was the shadows, or my mind playing tricks on me after too many long nights alone in the tower. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The scratching continued, though, growing louder as the days passed. And it wasn't just in the walls anymore. I started hearing it outside the tower, in the wind, in the space between the waves. Sometimes when I was standing at the edge of the cliff looking down at the rocks below, I'd swear I could hear it coming from the sea itself, a faint rasping noise carried on the wind. And then there were the shadows. At first I only saw them out of the corner of my eye, dark shapes flitting across the room, disappearing when I turned to look. But they became more frequent. I'd be sitting at the desk in the lighthouse, writing in the logbook, and I'd catch movement in the reflection of the window, a figure standing behind me watching. But when I turned, there was nothing there, just the empty room. One night when I was off duty, I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of the light turning overhead, the beam sweeping across the ocean. I was lying in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake off the weight of a dream I couldn't remember, when I noticed something at the foot of my bed. A figure stood there, just outside the range of the dim light from the lantern. It was tall, hunched, its features hidden in shadow, but I could feel its presence as if it was waiting for something. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding and every instinct screamed at me to get up, to run, but I was frozen, trapped by the thing that loomed in the darkness. It didn't move. It just stood there, silent, watching. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room was empty again. The next morning I confronted McAllister. He looked at me with that knowing, weary expression, the kind that made me feel like a child who'd seen a monster under the bed. But he didn't deny anything. He just told me to keep my head down, do my work, and wait for the relief crew. He didn't say it outright, but I could tell he had seen things too. Things he wouldn't talk about. Things he'd learned to live with. O'Leary wasn't doing well either. He had grown pale and jumpy, flinching at every sound, every shadow. He spent most of his time in his bunk, barely speaking, barely eating. I think he was starting to crack under the strain. Then one morning I woke up and found his bunk empty. His things were still there, his coat hanging on the hook, his boots by the door. But O'Leary was gone. We searched the lighthouse, called out for him, but there was no answer. McAllister and I scoured the cliffs, looked down at the rocks below, but there was no sign of him. The sea had taken him, McAllister said. That's what we wrote in the logbook, but I wasn't so sure. In the weeks that followed, the lighthouse felt different. The scratching had stopped, but the shadows remained, growing bolder. I started seeing the figure more often, not just in the cellar, but outside, standing on the rocks below, watching the tower. It would appear for just a moment and then disappear when I blinked or looked away. McAllister became quieter, more withdrawn, spending most of his time in the tower, staring out at the sea. He didn't say much, but I could tell something was weighing on him. One night, when it was my shift in the tower, I heard the door below creak open. I thought it was McAllister coming to relieve me early, but when I went to check, the staircase was empty. The wind howled through the cracks in the stone, and as I turned to go back up, I saw it. The figure, standing at the bottom of the stairs, its face hidden in shadow, staring up at me. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck rising. I didn't move, I couldn't, and then, without a sound, it began to climb the stairs. I've been at the lighthouse for 3 months now. It stands on a lonely spit of land, far from anything resembling civilization. The sea surrounds it on all sides, vast and unfeeling, crashing against the rocks below. My shift is long, 6 months at a stretch, but I had wanted the isolation. It seemed easier than dealing with people. A way to clear my head, I thought. Get some distance. There are 2 other keepers with me. We take shifts, maintain the light, log the weather, and generally make sure the beacon is steady. Jackson is the senior man, and Thompson, like me, is new to this kind of work. They don't talk much, which suits me fine. The days blur into one another in a quiet routine, broken only by the endless rhythm of the ocean and the constant sweep of the light. At first, I welcomed the solitude. It was almost peaceful, the constant hum of the waves below, the wind battering the tower. There was something comforting about the regularity of it all, the light turning steadily every few seconds, the same meals, the same tasks. But after a while, something in the silence began to change. It's hard to explain, but there was a moment when I realized the quiet wasn't comforting anymore. It was too deep, too complete. It began creeping into me, filling every corner of the space until it wasn't just around me, it was inside me too. The days stretched longer, the nights colder, and I found myself staring out at the horizon more often, as if looking for something that wasn't there. The sea seemed so endless, so indifferent. One night during my shift in the tower, I noticed something strange. The light turned as usual, sweeping across the black waves, but as it completed its arc, I thought I saw a figure, just a shadow, standing on the rocks far below. I blinked, leaning closer to the glass. It was gone. Nothing but the darkness and the distant crash of the waves. I shook it off, but it stuck with me. I couldn't tell if it was my mind playing tricks, or if there had really been someone out there. I hadn't seen a boat in weeks. No one came out here unless they had to. After that night, I started noticing small things. I'd leave a room and return to find a chair moved an inch from where it had been. Papers on the desk ever so slightly shifted. I asked the others about it, casually during our meals, but they didn't seem to notice. Maybe I was imagining it, I told myself. Maybe it was the isolation playing with my head, but then it got worse. The noise started, a faint tapping sound that came from somewhere in the walls. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It was always just out of reach, just quiet enough to make me question whether I'd really heard it at all. At first it was occasional, just a small irritation, like a dripping faucet in another room. But it grew louder, more persistent, until it seemed to follow me around the lighthouse, echoing in my head. I started losing sleep. My shifts in the tower became harder to get through. I'd find myself staring blankly into the night, the beam of the light slicing through the dark, and I'd lose track of time. Hours would pass, and I'd have no memory of them. I'd check the logbook and see notes in my handwriting, but I couldn't remember writing them. I began to feel like I was being watched, though I knew that was impossible. The lighthouse was isolated, nothing but endless water surrounding us. But still, that sensation stayed with me. I would sit in the common room trying to read, and catch myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, just out of sight. But there was never anyone. The tapping, though, it was always there. One night, during a storm, the sound became unbearable. It was louder than the wind, louder than the sea pounding the rocks. I couldn't take it anymore. I left my post and went down into the lower levels, determined to find the source. I tore open the doors to storage rooms, checked every corner, every inch of wall, but there was nothing. The sound seemed to move, as if it were trying to stay ahead of me, just beyond my reach. By the time I returned to the main room, I was soaked in sweat, my hands trembling. Jackson and Thompson looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. I couldn't sleep after that. Every time I closed my eyes, the sound would start up again, louder, more insistent. It was no longer just a tapping, it was something more. Something that seemed to pulse in time with my own heartbeat. Something that had rhythm and purpose. The days after that are a blur. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. The isolation, the endless monotony, the sea stretching out forever. It all began to feel like a weight pressing down on me. I'd see shadows where there shouldn't be shadows. Hear voices in the wind, though I knew no one was there. And then I started to see the figure again, always just on the edge of my vision, standing on the rocks below or in the mist that rolled in off the sea. I never got a clear look, but I knew it wasn't one of us. It couldn't have been. There was something wrong about the way it moved, the way it stood there, waiting. I'd look away for a moment, and when I looked back, it was gone. The others grew distant, too. I noticed Jackson and Thompson whispering to each other, casting glances in my direction when they thought I wasn't looking. I knew they thought I was losing it, and maybe they were right. Maybe I was. I couldn't blame them for keeping their distance. I started avoiding them too, staying in the tower longer than necessary, spending hours just staring out at the sea, waiting for something, anything to break the silence. The last few nights before the end, I didn't sleep at all. I couldn't. The sound was everywhere now, filling the walls, filling my head. I'd wander the halls, pacing, trying to outrun it, but it was always there, getting louder, faster, until it was all I could hear. I'd stand by the window, looking out at the black water and swear I could see the figure, always watching, always waiting, and then, one night, everything stopped. The sound, the shadows, all of it. It was like the lighthouse had gone silent, but it wasn't a relief. The silence was worse. It was suffocating. That's when I realized Jackson and Thompson hadn't come down for dinner. I went to check their rooms. Both were empty. I searched the lighthouse, calling their names, but there was no answer. They were gone. I don't know what happened to them. I don't know if they left or if something else took them, but I haven't seen them since. Now it's just me, the lighthouse, and the sea. I'm waiting for the relief boat, but it's late. The light keeps turning, and I keep watching, listening. Sometimes, in the quiet, I think I can still hear the tapping. Other times, I see the figure standing on the rocks below, looking up at me. I wonder how much longer I have. I've been at this lighthouse for longer than I care to admit. You lose track of the days after a while when the sea is the only thing you see and the wind howls constantly outside. Time here stretches, days blend. There's no real distinction between morning and night, between one week and the next. Just endless waves, endless isolation. The three of us, me, Foster, and McAllister, have been here for months now. The relief boat was supposed to come weeks ago, but the weather has been too rough. The radio crackles occasionally, but we haven't heard a voice on the other end in days. It's like we've been forgotten. It wasn't always like this. When we first arrived, everything was routine. We all had our roles, keeping the light in working order, checking the log books, monitoring the weather reports. The lighthouse is old, but it's reliable, a little creaky, always cold, but it does its job. At first, the three of us were content to pass the time. We played cards in the evenings, shared stories over the weak coffee, talked about what we'd do when we got back to the mainland. But after a while, the isolation started to weigh on us. The sea became an endless gray void. The wind that used to lull me to sleep now gnaws at my nerves. There's no escaping it. It whistles through every crack in the tower, rattles the windows, shakes the doors in their frames. The nights are long, the darkness even longer. It's hard to explain when it started, but something shifted between us. Little irritations, things we'd have laughed off before, started to gnaw at us. Foster's habit of whistling under his breath, McAllister's constant tapping on the table. Small things, but out here, with nothing but each other and the sea, they start to feel bigger, like nails scratching at the inside of your skull. At first it was just tension, the kind you expect after being stuck in close quarters for too long. But then came the strange looks, the moments when I'd catch one of them staring at me from across the room, eyes too intense, too focused. Or the nights when I'd hear footsteps on the stairs after we were supposed to be asleep, the creak of the floorboards above me as if someone was pacing. Whenever I brought it up, they'd just shrug, say I was imagining things. But I could see it in their faces. They were feeling it too. The lighthouse plays tricks on your mind after a while. The sound of the wind, the relentless crash of the waves, they seep into your head. You start seeing things in the shadows, hearing voices in the wind. I've seen Foster standing at the window, staring out at the sea for hours, like he's expecting something to rise out of the water. McAllister has taken to locking himself in his room for long stretches, muttering under his breath, though I can never make out what he's saying. And me? I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I'm losing my grip on reality, the isolation, the monotony. It's like it's rewiring my brain. The lighthouse itself feels like it's alive, breathing with the rhythm of the ocean, the walls pulsing with some strange energy. At night, I lie awake, listening to the groaning of the tower, and I swear, I hear voices beneath the wind, whispering things I can't quite understand. A few nights ago, I woke up with the sense that something was watching me. I lay there, staring into the darkness, heart pounding, but the room was empty, just the shadows shifting and the faint light coming through the window. I told myself it was just the wind, just the isolation getting to me. But it's hard to shake the feeling that there's something else out here with us. The tension between the three of us has gotten worse. It's like we're all waiting for something to happen, something we can't name but can feel pressing in on us. We've started snapping at each other over nothing, voices raised over stupid things. Whose turn it is to tend the light, whether someone took more than their share of food, even the way we breathe. Foster accused McAllister of hiding something the other day, but he wouldn't say what. It didn't make sense, but it set McAllister off. They almost came to blows before I stepped in. I know we need to stay focused. The relief boat will come eventually. We just need to make it until then. But each day feels harder than the last. There's this undercurrent of suspicion between us now, this constant feeling like one of us is about to snap. I've caught Foster locking the door to his room at night like he's afraid one of us will try to get in. McAllister, on the other hand, has started leaving his door wide open, sitting up all night with a knife on the table beside him, like he's waiting for something to come for him. The other night I was on watch, staring out at the horizon. It was pitch black, nothing but the beam of the light sweeping across the sea. The wind was howling louder than usual, and the waves were monstrous, crashing against the rocks below. I don't know why, but I had this sudden urge to go outside, to stand on the edge of the cliff and look out over the water. It was like something was calling me. I found myself standing at the base of the tower, staring out at the dark water below. The wind was freezing, biting at my face, but I barely felt it. All I could think about was the sea, the way it seemed to be moving differently, as if something was stirring beneath the surface. I don't know how long I stood there just staring, but when I finally turned back to the lighthouse, I saw someone standing in the doorway. At first I thought it was Foster or McAllister, but there was something wrong about the figure. It didn't move, didn't say anything. It was just standing there watching me. My heart was in my throat as I took a step closer, trying to make out who it was. But before I could get close enough, the figure disappeared back into the lighthouse. I ran inside, but the place was empty. Both Foster and McAllister were in their bunks, fast asleep. I haven't told them what I saw. I don't know if they'd believe me, or if it's just my mind playing tricks on me. But since that night, I felt this growing sense of dread, like the lighthouse itself is trying to push us over the edge. The isolation, the constant wind, the endless sea, it's all wearing us down, fraying the edges of our sanity. I've started keeping my back to the wall whenever I'm in the tower with the others. It's not that I don't trust them, but I can't shake the feeling that something is building between us, something dangerous. Foster has taken to carrying around a length of rope, always fiddling with it, tying knots absent-mindedly. McAllister, meanwhile, hardly speaks anymore. He just stares at the floor, his hands twitching like he's holding something invisible. We can't afford to turn on each other. We need to hold it together, to stay sharp. But every day feels like a battle now, a fight against whatever is clawing at our minds. The light needs to stay on, the logs need to be kept, and we need to work together if we want to survive. But it's getting harder to trust them, to trust myself. Last night I woke up to a noise outside my door. It was faint, like someone whispering. But when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. I checked the others, both asleep or at least pretending to be. I can't be sure anymore. I feel like we're all waiting for the moment when one of us snaps, when the thin thread holding us together finally breaks. I've started to wonder if we'll make it until the relief boat arrives, or if it's even coming at all.